People say you can't burn a memory, but they're wrong. My stepmother Ruth believed you could, and for most of my life, she tried. She believed that if you swept every trace of the past into the fire, every letter, every photo, every relic of a previous life, the house would stop whispering. The ghosts would finally pack up and leave. Her war against the past wasn't waged with arguments or slammed doors. It was conducted in silence, in small, precise acts of erasure. Not a photograph, not a song, not a handwritten note from my mother could survive her. If you wanted to find my mother's ghost in our house, you'd have to search the cracks in the floorboards or catch her reflection in the glass at dusk, just as the last of the light slipped away. Some evenings, if I sat quietly at the landing, I could almost hear her laughter mingling with the sound of rain on the roof, faint, but there. I sometimes imagined my mother was tucked into the worn-out creases of the old living room sofa, or hidden behind the chipped paint on the garden gate, stubborn in the face of Ruth's campaigns. I was 16 when Ruth's crusade against memory reached its peak. By then, the house no longer smelled of my mother's lavender soap or her favorite vanilla candles. Instead, it had the cold, soapy neutrality of bleach, the careful sterility of a hotel lobby, a place you visit, not a place you belong. My father and I had lived under Ruth's regime for nearly 3 years, and in that time he'd faded from the man I once knew, gentler, grayer, hollowed by loss and unable to resist the daily tide of small changes Ruth introduced. He'd become a stranger moving in the same circles, orbiting the kitchen, the garage, the den, never quite at home in any of them. The process started quietly, almost invisibly, as these things often do. First, Ruth moved her own clothes into the master closet, squeezing my mother's favorite blue cardigan between her tightly pressed suits. Then she swapped the bedspread for a stiff white coverlet that looked like it belonged in a catalog. She replaced the threadbare curtains, yellowed with age and sunlight, but my mother's pride, with new ones, pale gray and immaculately pressed. My mother's recipe box disappeared from the kitchen, leaving a gap beside the stove where the smell of cinnamon and apples used to linger long after baking days. The record player my mother had loved, where we danced on rainy afternoons to the scratchy, warbling sound of her favorite Carole King album, vanished one day without explanation. When I asked, Ruth would say, "You're too old for that kind of nostalgia, Clara. Things have to change." Her voice was always brisk, matter-of-fact, almost reasonable if you didn't listen to the undertone. But what I clung to most, the one thing Ruth hadn't touched, was the blue box of letters under my bed. My mother wrote to me often, even when she was alive. Letters tucked into lunchboxes with little doodles in the corners, birthday cards with a paragraph or two in her looping hand, notes left on my pillow when I was sick or scared or angry. After she died, I read those letters until the creases wore thin and the ink blurred in places from my tears. They were not grand, poetic declarations. Some were about homework, some about the weather or a favorite recipe. But they were evidence. My mother loved me, and at one time, our family was whole. The box itself was nothing special. A faded shoebox wrapped in scraps of blue floral paper, secured with a length of fraying ribbon. I kept it hidden beneath a pile of old magazines and school books. Some nights, after Ruth and my father went to bed, I would pull it out, sit cross-legged on the floor, and read until my eyes ached. Sometimes I would whisper the words aloud, hoping my mother could hear them from wherever she was. Those letters became my lifeline, a conversation that continued long after her voice had gone silent. If Ruth knew about the box, she didn't say, at least not at first. But I should have known nothing escaped her notice. She noticed when I wore my mother's scarf on cold days, when I made her favorite soup, when I played the one record she hadn't managed to find and discard. The look in Ruth's eyes when she caught me at any of this was never anger, just the cold, superior certainty that she would win in the end. It was as if she'd decided that love itself was a childish indulgence, something to be tidied up with the rest of the mess. Still, I fought my small battles. I kept my mother's favorite mug hidden in the back of my closet. I tucked a photograph behind a loose brick in the garden wall. I pressed rose petals from my mother's last bloom between the pages of my geometry textbook, praying Ruth would never think to look there. Each of these acts felt dangerous, even rebellious, proof that some things, however small, could survive. But Ruth was patient. She waited for the right moment, the moment when my father was away on business and I was too exhausted by school and work to keep up my guard. That end came on a night in early November, cold enough that the windows fogged up as I walked home from my after-school job. I remember the sting of wind on my cheeks, the way my breath hung in the air as I crossed the porch, every step already filled with the sense that something was wrong. I opened the front door and was hit by a sharp, unnatural heat. The living room glowed with a fire burning far too high, throwing restless shadows up the walls. I could smell something acrid beneath the wood smoke, an odor that hit me with a wave of nausea. I knew before I saw it. You don't forget the smell of paper burning, especially when the words belong to someone you love. Ruth stood by the fireplace, sleeves rolled up, the blue box open beside her on the hearth. She was feeding my mother's letters into the flames, page by page, watching the paper curl and blacken before turning to ash. She glanced up as I entered. Her expression wasn't triumphant exactly. It was the look of a surgeon finishing a difficult operation, the grim satisfaction of a job that had to be done. These things only bring pain, Clara. It's time to move forward. You're not a little girl anymore. For a second, I could not move. My fists clenched so tightly my nails bit my palms. I wanted to shout, to shove her aside, to claw the burning pages from the fire. I imagined grabbing her wrist, yanking the box away, throwing myself to the floor and scooping up the fragile scraps before they were gone. But I stood rooted, numb and cold despite the heat. The flames reflected in Ruth's eyes.
"They're mine," I managed, the words scraping my throat. "They're all I have left." Ruth shrugged, turning another letter between her fingers before tossing it onto the coals. "Your mother would want you to grow up, to be practical. This obsession, it isn't healthy." Her words landed like blows. For Ruth, practicality was a virtue above all others. Grief, to her, was a mess to be wiped away. I watched the last of the letters vanish. Ruth tossed the empty blue box onto the coals, and in seconds it was gone, taking my childhood with it. I stumbled upstairs, feeling hollow, my skin prickling with the stink of smoke. That night, I sat at my window until dawn, the world outside washed pale and colorless. I tried to remember every line, every silly joke and loving note, every bit of advice my mother had ever written. I could not. The words came in snatches, half sentences, a phrase here or there, never a whole letter. That was the first time I realized how fragile memory really is, how easily it can be lost when you have nothing to anchor it to. For days after, the house felt colder, emptier. Ruth moved through it as if nothing had happened. She set the table with her china, humming tunelessly as she moved through the kitchen. My father noticed nothing. Or, if he did, he chose to let it slide. He had grown skilled at avoiding conflict, at nodding and smiling through the tightening grip of Ruth's order. Our home became a museum of someone else's life. The erasure continued, relentless and total. The garden was tamed, the wild roses my mother planted replaced with boxwoods. Family photos disappeared from the hallway, replaced with portraits of Ruth's friends, her trips, her triumphs. Even the air seemed different, as if Ruth had opened the windows and swept out the very scent of the woman who came before her. The kitchen, once alive with warmth and laughter, now echoed with the clink of Ruth's utensils and the sound of her heels on tile. I went through the motions of living. School, chores, the after-school job I took only to stay away from the house. I ate dinner in silence, did my homework late at night, and slept fitfully, waking from dreams of burning paper and my mother's voice calling to me from behind locked doors. Some mornings I would find a new rule posted on the fridge, another improvement Ruth had made, another piece of my world claimed for her own. Through it all, I became expert at invisibility. I made myself small, unremarkable, hard to pin down. Ruth would never say it, but I could feel her irritation when I slipped out early or came home late, always managing to miss her favorite TV shows or her mandatory family dinners. Her victory over my mother's memory was never quite complete as long as I still walked those halls. I saw the way she watched me sometimes, as if she were waiting for me to vanish too. Some nights, I thought about running away, leaving Ruth to her pristine house and empty memories. But I stayed. Not out of loyalty, not out of love for my father, but out of sheer stubbornness. The same stubbornness Ruth accused me of every time I challenged her rules. Someone had to remember, I thought. Someone had to bear witness.
I made a secret ritual of visiting the attic. It was the one place Ruth seemed to fear. The dust, the spiders, the boxes stacked like miniature tombstones of past lives. Sometimes I would sit for hours, hoping to find some overlooked scrap, a birthday card, a stray photograph, a page torn from a diary. Most days I found nothing but dust and sadness. Still, the attic was a refuge, a space untouched by her order. The old rafters groaned in the wind, and I'd let myself imagine my mother still lingered there, patient and unbroken. One afternoon, during a particularly gray Sunday where the world seemed suspended between seasons, I found myself drifting upstairs, footsteps muffled by the thick rug Ruth had always hated. The attic door stuck as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold and close, thick with the scent of mildew and forgotten dreams. I poked through boxes of winter coats, old textbooks, Christmas ornaments. Then, in a stack of books so old their covers were curled and brittle, one fell to the floor and opened itself, as if offering up a secret. Inside was an envelope, thick and cream-colored, the ink faded but clear. It was not my mother's handwriting. My heart thudded in my chest as I slid out the folded page and read, "My dearest R, I know what we have is impossible, but I cannot let go of you. Every moment we steal is a balm to my heart, a secret I carry even as I walk beside your husband. I think of you always. J." I stared at the letter, not comprehending at first. The name at the bottom, just a single initial, made my fingers go numb. Then I saw the date, 1999, the year Ruth married my father. It felt like the attic itself shifted, a slant of sunlight turning the dust to gold as I sat on an old trunk, the letter trembling in my hand. The shock was slow to rise. At first I felt only confusion, then anger, then something sharper, a clarity that felt almost like a relief. Ruth, who had destroyed every last word my mother left behind, had her own letters, hidden, secret, vulnerable to the same fate. I read the letter again, the words burning into my memory, the longing in those lines, the secret shame and pride. For the first time, I saw Ruth not as the victor, but as someone just as haunted by her own past as I was by mine. Her erasure wasn't only for me, it was for herself, a battle she fought against the parts of her that refused to die. I replaced the letter in the book, hands trembling, and sat there for a long time, the cold attic air pressing in from all sides. Downstairs, Ruth's laughter drifted up, brittle and artificial. She would never know I had found the first thread in her tapestry of secrets. It was not triumph I felt, not quite.
It was the first breath of power I'd tasted in years, a shift in the balance, a sign that the past could not be so easily managed or destroyed. For every word Ruth burned, there was another waiting, hidden in the walls or between the pages of old books. I promised myself, there, in the half-light of dust and memory, I would find the rest. Ruth would not be the only one with power over words and history. The past would not be burned so easily, and when the time came, I would be ready.
There are secrets you stumble on and secrets you pursue because you need to see what lies at the bottom, no matter how dark. For a long time, my life felt ruled by the first kind, a child's accidental knowledge of adult grief, a glimpse of pain through a half-open door. But after I found that first letter in the attic, a single page, cream paper in longing ink, written not to my father but to Ruth, the world changed. Just one letter was enough to show me the fault line running beneath everything, and I felt the old helplessness fall away. Agency is a quiet, feral thing, and once it wakes up, it never goes back to sleep. The woman who'd wiped my mother from the walls and the air of our house, who'd prided herself on leaving no evidence of the life before her, had missed something. She'd left her own footprints in the very dust she'd tried to sweep away. Ruth wasn't immune to the past. She was merely better at hiding its evidence, except, as I was learning, not quite good enough. After that first letter, my relationship with the house and with Ruth shifted. I moved through the rooms differently, watching and listening in a way I never had before. At breakfast, I watched how she folded the newspaper, how she bristled if the mail was late or if a neighbor's voice drifted through the open kitchen window. I noticed which drawers she locked, which rooms she kept closed, which boxes she shifted from one closet to another. I paid attention to her moods, the brittle tension when she lost at bridge, the way her voice sharpened when the garden didn't grow as she wanted, the icy silence that fell over dinner whenever my father's name was mentioned. She had built her life on order, but beneath it all, I sensed chaos, something she fought to keep buried. She wore her composure like armor, but I began to see the cracks, small and fleeting. There were days when she lost track of her own rules, when I'd catch her standing in the hallway, staring at a closed door, her hand hovering just above the knob as if she'd forgotten what she was looking for. I became a detective in my own home. I started by making a mental map of Ruth's domains, the study, her closet, the sewing room that had once been the music room, the attic she avoided unless company was coming and dusting was unavoidable. She ruled the kitchen with military precision, but she was less vigilant about the rest, especially as her focus turned toward maintaining her image outside the house. My next find came on a day so ordinary, it's a wonder anything changed. I'd come home from school early, the house empty except for the hum of the fridge and the distant chime of Ruth's phone somewhere upstairs. The air was filled with the scent of freshly polished wood, a smell I'd come to associate with Ruth's efforts to erase fingerprints, to scrub the past right out of the grain. I wandered into her study, a room that had once been my father's sanctuary, now a shrine to Ruth's achievements, framed certificates from the Women's Club, awards for volunteer work, neat binders of committee notes with Ruth's looping initials on every page. The desk was meticulously arranged. I could almost hear my father's voice, softer than Ruth's, telling me about the birds at the feeder or reading out loud from the newspaper. That man was long gone. I noticed a leather-bound planner on Ruth's desk, the kind with a zippered pocket for important papers. Normally, Ruth kept it with her, but she'd left it behind, likely distracted by a phone call or a knock at the door. I hesitated, part of me still loyal to the old frightened self, but curiosity won. Inside, tucked between calendar pages and receipts, was another envelope. My breath caught. This letter was longer, the handwriting more rushed, the words sharper. Dearest Ruth, tomorrow's the party.
I will watch you from across the lawn and try not to betray myself. It aches, being this close and yet so far from you. How cruel that all the world believes your heart belongs to someone else. I love you, and I always will. J. The date, 3 years into her marriage to my father. I felt the room tilt as if I'd stepped into an entirely different house, one I'd never been allowed to visit before. I slipped the letter into my backpack, heart pounding, my face flushed with guilt and something like exhilaration. That letter made it real. Ruth wasn't just a tyrant, an interloper, a destroyer of memories. She was a woman with a secret, a past she guarded with the same ferocity she used to police mine. And that secret had left a trail, however faint. I realized that if there were 2 letters, there might be more, dozens maybe, or even hundreds. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. I became more methodical. With each new letter I found, a new piece of the puzzle fell into place. I searched jacket pockets on coats meant for charity donation, leafed through books she'd boxed up for the church sale, checked the zipped compartment of her old gardening tote, even the side pockets of a battered suitcase that had belonged to my father. Ruth was clever, but she underestimated how desperate a person can become when everything has been taken from them. Some discoveries were small, a scrap of an airmail envelope here, a torn corner of stationery there, a line of poetry copied onto the back of an old grocery list. Some were larger. One day, hidden in the lining of a suitcase destined for the attic, I found a set of 3 folded notes, each signed J. R. I waited in the park for you until dusk. The rain soaked me through, but I stayed, hoping, longing. How long will we keep pretending this is enough? And another, written with trembling intensity. Sweetest, he touched your shoulder tonight at dinner. I saw you stiffen and wanted to kill the air between you. Tell me, do you dream of a time when you'll be free? The language was raw, direct, unguarded in a way I'd never heard Ruth speak to anyone. It was as if the woman who policed every detail of my life had poured all her messiest, neediest parts into these hidden pages, parts she'd never allowed herself, never allowed me to see, never allowed herself to own in the daylight. I imagined her, late at night, hunched over her desk, writing feverishly and then hiding the evidence, the way a thief might hide her spoils. As I read, anger mingled with understanding. Ruth had built her new life on the ruins of my mother's. She destroyed my childhood in the name of starting over. But beneath the perfect surface, she carried a love she could never claim openly, a secret that had haunted her through years of forced smiles and perfect parties. She had her own ache, her own half-buried grief.
But her pain didn't erase mine. If anything, the hypocrisy made it sharper. How could she mourn a secret lover while denying my right to grieve my mother? How could she demand control, demand silence, and yet keep these words, her own illicit relics, hidden in plain sight? I found myself examining every interaction, every small kindness or cruelty through a new lens. Was Ruth's need for control a shield against guilt, or just her nature? Did she ever think, when she tossed my mother's letters into the fire, that she'd one day be haunted by her own? I became obsessed with finding every scrap. It was a game, but it was also a rescue mission, saving the parts of the story Ruth never wanted told. I made copies of every letter, scanned and saved them on an encrypted drive, printed duplicates I locked in my dorm at college. I spent late nights in the library, working on school assignments, while the scanner quietly hummed beside me, preserving what Ruth could not erase. It became an act of preservation. The more Ruth tried to erase, the more I collected. I took comfort in the ritual of searching, cataloging, reading. Each letter gave me strength, and with it, the resolve to someday set the record straight. On campus, my friends knew me as reserved, focused, hard to distract. They didn't know that in my spare moments, I was plotting a slow, quiet justice. I sometimes wondered if Ruth suspected anything. She would ask, "How are your studies?" with a forced brightness, her eyes flicking to my bag, my coat, my shoes, anywhere I might have hidden something. But if she worried, she never showed it. During holidays, I returned home, always careful to greet Ruth with the appropriate cheer, to offer to help with dinner, to chat with her guests. Inside, I measured every conversation for openings, every lull for another chance to explore, to find another piece of her hidden past. The rituals of family life became my camouflage. I peeled carrots while plotting how to check the pockets of her winter coat. I smiled through holiday toasts while wondering if the guest room held another forgotten cache. Sometimes in the quiet after dessert, I'd sneak upstairs, heart pounding, to rifle through an old jewelry box or the file cabinet in the hall. As Ruth grew older, her vigilance waned, but her need for control remained. She continued to orchestrate family holidays, community events, her own birthday parties with all the precision of a general. But cracks showed in the facade. She snapped at waiters, bristled at minor slights, retreated to her room for rest that lasted hours. Some nights I heard her pacing, her footsteps anxious and unsteady. I learned to listen for these sounds the way you listen for rain before a storm. It was during one of these winter breaks that I realized Ruth was truly declining. A cough she dismissed as seasonal lingered for weeks. She lost weight, grew paler, and moved through the house with her old brittle energy replaced by something hollow. The diagnosis, cancer, advanced, came by way of a neighbor, not Ruth herself. Pride and privacy remained her strongest defenses. When she finally let me in, it wasn't with words, but with silence. I offered to help. She accepted with a grudging nod. Now I moved openly through the house, sorting bills, organizing medication, making sure the nurse had what she needed. Ruth became my patient, not my guardian, and the power dynamic flipped in ways both subtle and vast. But the letters, I kept them secret. They were not ammunition, not yet. They were a promise, a safeguard, a record that would one day speak for themselves. I started keeping a log, writing down where I found each note, each scrap, building a timeline that stretched from the year Ruth met my father until just before her diagnosis. I saw patterns, times of hope, times of fear, times when Jay's handwriting grew frantic, times when it stopped altogether for months at a time. Sometimes Ruth would look at me with an odd expression, a mix of suspicion and resignation. She never apologized. The closest she came was one afternoon as I was changing her sheets, when she murmured, "You're stubborn, just like your mother." I smiled, folding a corner of the blanket. She taught me to survive. Ruth closed her eyes. It's not always a blessing, you know? There was a vulnerability in her voice I'd never heard before. A tremor of regret, maybe? Or fear? Her decline accelerated. Friends called less frequently. Ruth directed her own care with icy precision, but her hand shook and her voice wavered. I sorted her belongings, finding more notes, some recent, some ancient, a diary entry here, a coded appointment card there. I preserved them all, building a file so complete that even Ruth could not have destroyed it, no matter how thorough her fire. I found a diary from her first year with my father. The entries were short, full of lists and reminders, but between the lines there were sighs, mentions of Jay, coded phrases about quiet walks, and the one thing I can't write. I began to see the loneliness behind her control, the price she'd paid for winning. Even victory, it seemed, could be its own cage. One night, sitting in the attic, I read through the archive I'd assembled. Dozens of letters, a handful of faded photos, take-it stubs and scraps of poetry. I saw the shape of Ruth's longing,
her hunger for a life that was never really hers, her determination to rewrite the world to suit her pain. I remembered her words after burning my mother's letters. "It's time to move forward. You're not a little girl anymore." Now I understood that those words were meant for herself as much as for me. I realized finally that my own healing would not come from hurting Ruth directly. It would come from telling the truth in the right way at the right time. I could not bring back my mother's letters, but I could give Ruth's secrets the daylight she denied my mother's love. I could refuse to be erased. I made myself another promise. When the moment came, I would be ready. Not to shame Ruth, but to end the cycle of silence. No more words burned, no more stories buried. When Ruth's story was finally told, it would be whole, messy, painful, unedited, and true. I thought about my mother in those nights, how she would have handled Ruth's cruelty, how she would have found a way to forgive, or at least to understand. I wasn't sure I could do the same, but I knew I could do what was right. Let the story be told, every part of it. That promise was the ending of my old powerlessness, the beginning of a new chapter, one where I decided whose voice was heard and whose story was left behind.
Some reckonings don't come all at once. They creep in on slow feet, gathering force in the dark, turning every quiet moment into a rehearsal for something you can't name, but know is coming. That's how it was with Ruth's final year. The sense of impending change hung over the house like thunder that never quite broke. Even the air tasted different. Heavy, metallic, a flavor of endings I'd learned to recognize. By then, the house on Hemlock Lane had almost forgotten it once belonged to someone else. Ruth's stamp was on everything. The arrangement of the furniture, the chill of the central air set just too cold for comfort, the art on the walls, abstract prints, tasteful, without story. My father's last remaining things were packed into 2 boxes in the garage: cufflinks, a faded baseball cap, a few books with his notes in the margins. My mother's traces were long gone. Sometimes, if the sun hit the banister at a certain angle, I'd see a smudge where her hand might have rested, and wonder if anyone but me could still feel her presence. After her cancer diagnosis, Ruth's world shrank to the boundaries of the house. For the first month, she was determined to do everything herself. She refused to hire nurses. She would not speak of pain, even as it crept into her bones and bent her posture. The kitchen remained spotless. Her closet was still arranged by color and season. But the order was a veneer. Underneath, I saw the panic. Control, always her shield, was slipping. She moved through the house with the careful precision of someone walking a tightrope, terrified of the fall. My visits became more frequent, each one a test of endurance. There was no open war between us, but every conversation felt loaded. Sometimes Ruth would quiz me about my job, my friends, the state of my car, trivial things, but with an edge, as if searching for evidence that her influence hadn't completely faded. Other days, she ignored me entirely, immersing herself in daytime television or long, silent phone calls with friends whose voices I recognized only from the brittle, performative tone she used when talking to them. I became the quiet observer. I watched how Ruth handled the medications, how she lined up pill bottles like soldiers along the windowsill. I listened for the sighs that escaped her when she thought she was alone. I noted the stacks of unopened mail, the growing pile of sympathy cards in the foyer, and the unreturned voicemails from neighbors and cousins. Some nights, I'd find her sitting in the living room, staring at nothing, her hands folded in her lap as if waiting for instructions. Once, she spoke without looking at me. "There's a draft in here. Your mother used to say the house was always cold." It was the closest she'd come to mentioning my mother in years. Ruth's friends drifted in and out, their visits less frequent as her decline became more visible.
They brought flowers and casseroles, left them in the kitchen with quick, uneasy hugs. "Let us know if you need anything," they said, but they didn't linger. Illness unsettled them. They preferred Ruth as she had always been, firm, decisive, a standard-bearer for the neighborhood's notion of dignity. With Ruth weakened, I took over more. I cooked simple meals, her old favorites, though she rarely ate much. I sorted her mail, paid her bills, fielded phone calls from old acquaintances, eager for updates but uncomfortable with details. "How is she?" they'd ask, never wanting to hear the truth.
It was during these weeks that I saw just how much effort it took Ruth to maintain her illusion of control. Even at her frailest, she would not allow herself to be seen uncomposed. "Don't let anyone in if I'm not dressed," she instructed, her voice sharp, even as her hands shook on the buttons of her sweater. When a neighbor dropped by unexpectedly, she sent me to answer the door while she retreated to her bedroom, makeup kit clutched like armor. I kept up my own routines, but always with one eye on Ruth and the other on the search that had become my private crusade. I now had a secret archive, growing steadily, dozens of letters from Jay, a handful of candid photographs, ticket stubs to obscure theater productions, old pressed flowers folded into the pages of Ruth's gardening book. I hid them in my luggage, in encrypted files, in a shoebox behind a loose brick in the garage. The risk no longer frightened me. I knew Ruth's strength was waning, and with it, her ability to police every corner of her domain. One afternoon, sorting laundry in the mudroom, I found a small stack of letters tucked into the pocket of Ruth's raincoat, the coat she hadn't worn since before my father died. The letters were older, dated from the first year of her marriage. They were shorter, hesitant, filled with longing and apology. "I wish things were different," Jay wrote, "but you and I both know what's possible and what isn't." The handwriting was jagged, sometimes smudged, as if written in haste or with trembling hands. The discovery gave me a jolt, but also a strange sense of satisfaction. I had once envied Ruth her certainty, her absolute authority in our home. Now I saw how much of it was a front, a bulwark against the shame and longing she'd never let herself resolve. She'd tried to burn away every trace of the past, but her own ghosts lingered, stubborn as mine. Sometimes, alone in the kitchen late at night, I'd sit with one of the letters spread before me, reading Jay's words aloud in a whisper. The language was old-fashioned, intense, full of the kind of hope that can only exist in secret. "Say my name aloud when you're alone," Jay wrote in one note, "and know I'm with you, if only in spirit." I imagined Ruth reading those lines, folding and unfolding them, hiding them away for years. I wondered about Jay. Who was he? A coworker? A friend? A neighbor? His identity was always masked by initials and vague references to the office, the garden party, the drive out to the lake. In some ways, it hardly mattered. What mattered was that Ruth had not been content with the world she'd fought so hard to create. Even as she erased my mother's existence, she'd nursed a secret longing, one that both nourished and tormented her. The knowledge didn't absolve her. If anything, it made her cruelty more personal. She'd known the pain of suppressed love, yet she'd denied me the right to grieve, to remember, to hold on to the pieces of my mother that meant the most. Her ruthlessness was not ignorance, it was a choice. Her illness was relentless. By late autumn, Ruth's hair had thinned, her skin grown papery and fragile. She wore long sleeves to cover the bruises from blood draws in IVs. Her voice grew softer, but no less insistent. "Make sure my jewelry goes to Margaret," she told me. "The silver to the church. The garden tools, throw them out if they're rusty." She listed her wishes as if dictating instructions to a maid, but I saw the fear behind the orders. "I don't want people picking through my things," she said. "No rummaging. Dignity, Clara, that's what matters at the end." Sometimes I wanted to scream at her, at myself, at the world that let her set the rules for so long. I wanted to tell her that dignity was not about secrecy or spotless rooms, but about honesty, about letting people see you as you truly are. But I said nothing. I played my role, dutiful, silent, careful not to overstep. I waited for the right moment. One rainy evening, Ruth asked me to bring her the blue jewelry box from her closet. As I handed it over, I noticed her hands shaking. She rummaged through the bracelets and brooches, then snapped the lid shut. "You always resented me," she said suddenly. "From the beginning, you never let me in." I met her gaze. Her eyes, once hard as flint, looked hollow now, rimmed with fatigue. "I just wanted my mother's things," I said. "Not even all of them, just something, anything." She looked away. "I did what I had to do. I wasn't trying to be cruel." Her voice caught, and for a moment I thought she might say more, but then the old mask slid back into place. "It doesn't matter now." But it did matter. It mattered to me. It mattered to the ghosts in the house, to the silences that thickened in the corners of every room. Winter closed in. Ruth spent more time in bed, her body growing smaller beneath the heavy quilts. The nurses came and went, unobtrusive, efficient. One, a gentle woman named Sarah, brought books and herbal teas, sitting with Ruth through the long afternoons while I worked from the kitchen table. I listened as Ruth told Sarah stories, some true, some embellished, all carefully curated. She spoke of her charity work, her garden, her late husband who left too soon. She never mentioned my mother, never spoke of Jay, never alluded to the fire or the lost letters. To outsiders, she was the paragon of grace under pressure. Sometimes I wanted to interrupt, to say, "She's holding on to everything. That's the problem." As Ruth grew weaker, her grip on routine loosened. I began sorting through her files, insurance policies, utility bills, a meticulous ledger of donations to the local museum. I found another envelope of letters, tucked into the back of her address book, each one more desperate than the last. Jay's handwriting grew shaky, the sentences clipped and uncertain. "Are you there? I miss you. I worry you're slipping away." The accumulation of secrets weighed on me. I felt as if I were living two lives, one as Ruth's caretaker, fulfilling the tasks she set, and another as a silent archivist, recording the private stories she'd tried so hard to bury. There were days I resented her, days I felt sorry for her, days I wondered if I was becoming like her, obsessed with the past, unable to move on. But I could not let go. The letters had become more than evidence. They were a record of survival, a proof that truth, no matter how deeply hidden, endures. On nights when the wind rattled the windows and the house felt more haunted than ever, I would take out a letter and read it aloud, as if conjuring the voices of the dead. The words echoed through the empty rooms, filling them with a history Ruth had tried to erase. In the weeks before the end, Ruth became obsessed with her legacy. "I want the funeral to be simple," she told me, then proceeded to outline every detail: the hymns, the guest list, the color of the flowers, the order of the eulogies. "No surprises, Clara," she said, her eyes boring into mine. "Nothing that will embarrass the family." I nodded, but inside I felt the storm gathering. I had promised myself the truth would not be buried. I had spent years collecting the story Ruth never wanted told. The time for silence was ending. Sometimes Ruth drifted into reverie, talking to people who weren't there. She'd call out for my father, for a friend from her youth,
for names I didn't recognize. One night, half awake from morphine, she whispered, "You know, it was never enough. All that order, all that control. In the end, it's the secrets that keep you company." I sat beside her, unsure whether to offer comfort or just bear witness. "It doesn't have to be secrets. It can be memories," I said quietly. But Ruth just shook her head. "Memories hurt more. That's why She broke off, coughing, and never finished the sentence. Her decline accelerated. The doctors stopped talking about treatments and focused on comfort. Hospice took over from the nurses. The house filled with the quiet rituals of the dying. Soft voices, careful footsteps, the scent of lilies and antiseptic. I spent my days answering phone calls, my nights writing lists and checking boxes on forms Ruth had prepared years before. I thought often of my mother in those days. I wondered how she would have handled Ruth's vulnerability, whether she would have forgiven or simply pitied. I tried to summon her voice in the silent hours, to imagine her telling me that kindness, in the end, is its own revenge. But I could not forgive. Not yet. Not until the truth had its turn. One afternoon, while packing up a drawer in the study, I found a notebook Ruth had kept during her first year with my father. It was filled with lists, groceries, social engagements, appointments. But here and there were notes in a different hand. "Miss you today. Call if you can get away. Don't forget, I love you." Jay's voice threaded through the fabric of Ruth's life, as indelible as any memory. I spent hours cataloging everything. I wrote dates, summarized contents, cross-referenced letters with family events and milestones. I began to see the arc of Ruth's affair, not a story of passion and romance, but one of longing, disappointment, fear. The more I learned, the more I understood that Ruth's victory over my mother had been incomplete. She had destroyed the evidence, but not the need. Her erasure of my mother was a monument to her own failure, a desperate attempt to claim a love that was never fully hers. Winter yielded to a cold, reluctant spring. Ruth's body continued its slow retreat. She grew smaller, more fragile. Her words, when they came, were filtered through pain and medication. The mask she'd worn for so long finally slipped. She wept sometimes, quietly, when she thought I couldn't hear. The day before she died, Ruth asked me to sit with her. She reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You'll make sure it's all handled?" she asked. "The house, the funeral, no drama. Promise me." "I promise," I said, but inside, I promised myself something else. I would not let her story be told on her terms alone. That night, after Ruth had drifted off to sleep, I went to the attic. I sat in the dust and darkness, surrounded by boxes of old life, holiday ornaments, school projects, forgotten toys. I took out the folder of letters and read them one by one. The longing, the sorrow, the confusion, they were all there, captured in ink that had outlasted flesh and bone. It struck me then that Ruth and I were more alike than I had ever wanted to admit. Both of us haunted by the past, both of us fighting to be heard, to matter, to leave our mark. But where she had chosen fire, I had chosen memory. Where she had erased, I had preserved. It was not forgiveness, but it was a kind of justice. In the morning, Ruth was gone. The house was still. The only sound was the ticking of the clock in the hallway, counting out the last seconds of her reign. I called the doctor, then the funeral home, then the family lawyer. I answered questions. I signed forms. I packed Ruth's belongings into boxes, labeled them for charity, for friends, for the dump. I kept the letters, the photographs, the scraps of poetry. I made a list of people to invite to the funeral. I checked the hymns and the flower order, just as Ruth had requested. But I also began to write my own eulogy, not for Ruth, but for the truth. I rehearsed the words in my mind.
Not an accusation, not a spectacle, but a testimony. Ruth's story would not end in silence. The secrets she had tried so hard to bury would see the light of day. The day before the funeral, I walked through the house one last time. The rooms were empty, stripped of the order Ruth had imposed. I stood in the garden, where my mother's roses had once bloomed, and let myself grieve for everything lost. My childhood, my parents, the years spent in the shadow of someone else's pain. But I also felt something else. A quiet satisfaction, the knowledge that I had survived, that I had kept faith with the past. The reckoning was almost here. All that remained was to step forward, to speak the truth, and to let the chips fall where they may. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. I dreamed of my mother's voice, strong and clear, urging me to remember, to bear witness, to honor the words that survived the fire.
In the morning, I woke to a world made new. Not perfect, not healed, but honest. The silence of the house was different now. Not empty, but expectant. As I dressed for the funeral, I tucked the folder of letters into my bag and looked in the mirror. For the first time, I saw myself not as the child Ruth had tried to erase, but as the woman who would decide whose story was left behind. Funerals are never really about the dead. They're a stage for the living to perform their grief, their loyalties, their relief. In a town like ours, where people wear secrets like perfume, the performance is everything. I woke on the morning of Ruth's funeral, feeling strangely calm, as if I'd been preparing for this day my whole life. The house was silent, the kind of hush that settles after a storm. I moved through it deliberately, collecting what I needed: a black dress my mother once wore, a plain envelope filled with the letters, a pen to jot down last-minute thoughts if courage failed. The sky outside was heavy with rain clouds, the kind of gray that blurs the world's edges and erases small sins. It felt right. Ruth would have preferred sunshine, orderly rows of mourners, perfect lighting for the flowers in the casket. But I found comfort in the gloom. It was as if even the weather was conspiring to strip the day of pretense. I arrived at the church before anyone else, my heels echoing on marble, the air cold and faintly sweet with lilies. The funeral director greeted me with practiced solemnity. "You're Clara, yes? If there's anything you need?" I shook my head. "I have everything." I stood for a long moment at the front of the sanctuary, staring at the closed casket. Ruth had chosen the photo that stood beside it, a formal portrait, pearls, her favorite navy suit, the same smile she wore to win over neighbors and club committees. The smile said, "Here is a woman who is above reproach. Here is a life without error." I sat in the front pew and waited as people trickled in. Ruth's friends, their faces kinched with obligation and curiosity, their condolences rehearsed. Margaret from the Bridge Club, fussing with her gloves. Mrs. Bloom, Ruth's favorite gossip, casting nervous glances at the guest list. The garden club president clutching a bouquet of white lilies as if they might protect her from anything unsavory that might be revealed. My father's old colleagues walking in slow, hunched groups, muttering about the traffic. My cousin Emily arrived last, her eyes red but sharp. She slipped into the pew beside me and squeezed my hand. "You all right?" she whispered. "I'm ready," and I meant it. The service began, and I lost myself in the ritual. Hymns, scripture, the minister's soothing platitudes. The congregation murmured in agreement as he spoke of Ruth's generosity, her devotion to family, her commitment to order and tradition. Each phrase landed like a stone in my gut, but I kept my face composed, my hands folded in my lap. The eulogy from Margaret was exactly as I had expected. Ruth was a pillar. She held us together. She believed in doing things right. Margaret's voice trembled, but the tears felt staged, wrung out for the sake of tradition. There was no mention of my mother, not even a reference to those who came before. In Ruth's narrative, the world began and ended with her. When the minister called for family remembrances, the room shifted. Heads turned. I felt their curiosity sharpen, a collective breath drawn. For years, I'd been background,
a girl half buried in the shadow of someone else's grief. Today, there was no shadow left to hide in. I stood, every movement deliberate. I carried the envelope to the lectern, feeling the eyes of the room settle on me. I'd practiced this moment in the attic, in the car, in my dreams. Still, the weight of the letters in my hand was grounding, not frightening. I began softly, letting the silence grow dense. Ruth believed in keeping things tidy. She believed the past should be orderly, its stories carefully managed, its messes swept away. I heard the murmur ripple through the crowd. She prided herself on knowing what to keep and what to burn. I paused. Some of you may remember how thoroughly she cleared out my mother's things, how every photo, every letter, every trace of the life that came before her was boxed up or burned. People shifted in their seats. The garden club president stared at her gloves. Margaret looked away. The minister gave a small, cautious nod, as if to say, "Yes, but let's not dwell." "But," I continued, "words don't burn so easily. Secrets have a way of surviving, even fire." I drew the envelope from my pocket. I opened the first letter, my voice steady. "My dearest R, I saw you at the market today, your smile brighter than the flowers you carried home. I wanted to follow you, to reach for your hand, to tell you that I am yours and have always been, even when you cannot say my name aloud. If love is a sin, let me burn for it, so long as you remember me." A hush fell. The words echoed in the church, foreign and intimate. People looked at one another, some confused, others already piecing things together. I read the second letter, dated just 3 years into Ruth's marriage to my father. "Tomorrow's the party. I will watch you from across the lawn and try not to betray myself. It aches being this close and yet so far from you. How cruel that all the world believes your heart belongs to someone else. I love you and I always will. J." Margaret's hand fluttered to her chest. Mrs. Bloom's eyes widened, flicking between me and the casket. The minister cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. "These," I said, holding up the letters, "are not stories of devotion to family. They are stories of longing, of secrets, of a love that could never quite bear the daylight." I closed the envelope, the paper soft from years of hiding. "I share these not to shame the dead, but to tell the truth that outlived the flames. Ruth taught us that order is everything, but real life, real love, is messier. Her story was never as simple as she made it seem." I walked to the casket, my footsteps ringing on marble, and placed the envelope gently among the flowers. "She loved other words more than Mom's," I said, quiet but clear. I saw the shock ripple from the front row to the back, a wave of discomfort and realization. As I returned to my seat, the spell of the funeral was broken. Whispers flared, sharp and quick. Margaret looked stricken. Mrs. Bloom's lips formed silent questions. The garden club president leaned in to confer with her neighbor. Emily squeezed my hand, hard. The service continued, but the tone had shifted. The final hymn was sung in a daze. The benediction faded before it reached the back pews. As the congregation filed out, I caught snippets of conversation. "Did you know? Is that true? How could she?" Like sparks in dry grass. At the reception in the church basement, people clustered in small groups, their voices hushed but urgent. Ruth's oldest friends avoided my gaze, some offering limp condolences, others hurrying past, as if afraid the truth might be contagious. A few younger women, nieces and neighbors' daughters, met my eyes with something like gratitude or envy. It was hard to tell. Margaret found me near the coffee urn. Her mascara had run. "Why would you do that, Clara? Why bring all that up now?" I studied her, saw the layers of habit and fear. "Because the story matters," I said, "even if it's not the one she wanted told." Margaret shook her head, but there was no anger, only exhaustion. She was always so careful. She thought she could keep it all under control. Some things can't be controlled. Some things survive anyway. A silence hung between us, a truce, not a peace. The garden club president approached next, her face tight. "If you think this changes anything, you're mistaken," she hissed, but her voice wobbled. "Ruth did a lot of good here, don't forget that." "I won't," I said, "but she hurt people too, and I won't forget that either." People began to drift out, the weather giving them an excuse to hurry. As the room emptied, I felt the tension drain from my body. The performance was over. Ruth's last act had ended not with applause, but with the uncertain shuffle of an audience unsure what they'd seen. Emily found me again, her expression fierce. "You did the right thing." "I hope so," I said. We left together, walking in silence to my car. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and unfamiliar. I looked back at the church, its lights golden in the gloom, and felt the weight of years lift, slowly but steadily. The next few days were a blur of logistics and aftermath. I met with the lawyer to finalize Ruth's estate, sorted through her belongings for distribution, and fielded a flood of phone calls from relatives and friends, some curious, some supportive, some furious. Rumors spread quickly. Some people called to scold me, insisting I'd ruined Ruth's memory, that I'd embarrassed the family, that I'd made a spectacle of private grief. Others whispered their thanks, confessing that Ruth's control had suffocated more than just me, that my mother's erasure had been felt by more than just her daughter. I spent hours in Ruth's house, emptying closets and drawers, boxing up dishes, setting aside the jewelry she'd bequeathed to Margaret, the silver for the church, the garden tools for donation. I found more letters, hidden in books, tucked into an old day planner, folded between the pages of her will. Each one added nuance to the portrait I'd uncovered. Not just a woman with secrets, but a woman whose life had always been split between what she wanted and what she could admit. I kept one letter for myself, the very first I'd found, the one that had started everything, that was proof, a talisman, a reminder that no one is ever as invulnerable as they seem. I spent evenings sorting through old photographs, building an archive of my own. My mother's face appeared in a handful, always on the edges, half turned away. In some, I recognized myself as a child, hair wild, eyes wary, clutching a stuffed animal my mother had sewn by hand. Ruth appeared in later years, always at the center, always immaculate. I began to write. Not just the story of the funeral, but the story of everything. The blue box of letters, the fire, the slow disappearance of my mother from the house and from our lives. I wrote about Ruth's rules, her obsession with control, her unacknowledged grief. I wrote about the letters from Jay, the way their language changed over the years, hopeful at first, then desperate, then resigned. I wrote about my father's silence, my own strategies for survival, the attic dust that hid both secrets and salvation. The writing was not therapy, it was testimony. I wanted a record that could not be burned. After the funeral, the house was finally sold. The proceeds went to charities Ruth had named, with the rest divided among the family. The neighbors planted new hedges, repainted their shutters, carried on with their lives as if nothing had changed. But I heard, in the months that followed, of conversations that had shifted, of other women who found the courage to keep their own relics, who refused to let grief be tidied up and put away. I moved to a small apartment in another city, bringing with me the box of letters and a few mementos from my childhood, a book my mother had loved, a scarf I'd hidden from Ruth, a photograph of the two of us on the back steps, laughing in the sun. For the first time, I felt free of the need to prove anything, to defend my memories from someone else's version of the past. Some nights, I dreamed of my mother, her voice clear and strong. She did not speak of Ruth, or of fire, or of loss. Instead, she asked me what I remembered, and I told her everything. The sound of her laughter, the feel of her hand in mine, the words she wrote, even if I could no longer recall every line. The town did not forget Ruth. Her name remained on plaques and donor lists, but her reputation had changed. She was no longer just the woman who kept everything in order. She was the woman with secrets, the woman whose story could not be contained by a single narrative. And as for me, I became something new. No longer just the girl whose mother had been erased. No longer the stepdaughter, the silent observer, the shadow in the background. I was the one who remembered, who gathered the words that survived, who let the truth breathe. One evening, as autumn returned, I visited the old church. The sanctuary was empty, the light golden on the pews. I sat in the front row and opened the letter I'd kept, the first letter, the one addressed to R. I read it aloud, softly, letting the words fill the space. It was not a spell. It was not an exorcism. It was simply a way of saying, I am here. I am still here. As I left, I placed a single rose on the altar, a rose from a bush my mother had planted, dug up before Ruth could replace it with boxwood. It was a small thing, but it was enough. On the walk home, I realized I was no longer waiting for permission to grieve, or to speak, or to remember. The story was mine now, whole, unfinished, indestructible.